So we might begin. Thank you, and welcome everyone. And looking forward to spending some time together. So, as usual, we'll spend some moments shaping our motivation, and we're going to do that by asking Lou to kindly lead the prayers. So, thank you.
Taking refuge in generating bodhicitta, I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Abandon evil doing, practice virtue well, subdue your mind. This is the Buddha's teaching. Like a star, an optical illusion or a flame, a magical illusion, a dewdrop or a bubble, like a dream, a flash of lightning or a cloud, so should one consider all compounded things. By this merit may we attain omniscience and overcome our enemy, our harmful deeds, and may beings buffeted by the waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death be liberated from the ocean of existence. The Heart of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. I prostrate to the Arya Triple Gem. Thus did I hear at one time. The Bhagavan was dwelling on Master Vulture's mountain in Rajagriha, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagavan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva Arya Avalokitesvara, looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom, and beheld those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then, to the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokitesvara: how should any son of the lineage trained who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokitesvara said this to the Venerable Shariputra: Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so on, up to and including no mind element and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on, up to and including no aging and death and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, Bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the endpoint of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, should be known as truth since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared. Tayata om gate gate paragate parasamgate bodhi soha. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then a Bhagavan arose from that concentration, and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya-Avalokitesvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage. It is like that, it is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagavan having thus spoken, the Venerable Shantideva, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya-Avalokitesvara, and those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, asuras, and Gandharvas, were overjoyed and highly praised, thus spoken by the Bhagavan. Praise to Manjushri. Homage to my Guru and Protector Manjushri, who holds to his heart a scriptural text, symbolic of the seeing of all things as they are, whose understanding shines forth as the sun, unclouded by delusions or traces of ignorance, who teaches in 60 ways with the loving compassion of a father for his only son, all creatures caught in the prison of samsara, confused in the darkness of ignorance, overwhelmed by their suffering. You whose dragon thunder-like proclamation of Dhamma arouses us from the stupor of our delusions and frees us from the iron chains of our karma, who wields the sword of wisdom, hewing down suffering wherever its sprouts appear, clearing away the darkness of all ignorance. You whose princely body is adorned with the 112 marks of a Buddha, who has completed the 10 stages achieving the highest perfections of a Bodhisattva, who has been pure from the beginning. I bow down to you, Manjushri. Om Rapatsanadi. With the brilliance of your wisdom, O compassionate one, illuminate the darkness of closing my mind, enlighten my intelligence and wisdom, so I may gain insight into the Buddha's words and the texts that explain them. By the virtue of offering to you assembly of Buddhas visualized before me, this mandala built on a base resplendent with flowers, saffron water, and incense, adorned with Mount Meru and the 4 continents, as well as the sun and the moon. May all sentient beings share in its good effects. Please enjoy and bless me and all sentient beings to be released from the 3 poisonous minds. For I am offering without attachment my body, enemies, friends, and strangers, and all possessions which are the objects of my greed, ignorance, and hatred. O holy and venerable Lama, from the clouds of compassion that form in the skies of your Dhammakama wisdom, please release a rain of vast and profound Dhamma, precisely in accord with the needs of those to be trained. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Neyatayami. I send forth this jeweled mandala to you, precious Gurus.
Thank you very much. Last week, we concluded the 4th chapter on applying conscientiousness. But Shantideva was so exhaustively thorough in presenting manifold arguments and from so many different directions to induce such like in our own practice speaks volumes to the vital importance of conscientiousness or carefulness in enabling and securing our fledgling bodhicitta practice. This is because conscientiousness is none other than, to quote Kunsang Pelden, none other than our own attentive and responsible implementation of the principle of adopting and rejecting. This is quite a marvelous passage, because we don't just withhold or withdraw ourselves from the danger that might lead to our transgression, as the meaning of conscientiousness. It means that within each and every circumstance, we are affording ourselves the opportunity of behaving in an appropriate manner, because we have developed our attentiveness, our ability to remain in contact with the object through awareness, if you like, and also our responsibility to maintain that awareness as the foundation of an ethical practice, principally not to harm others and to benefit them. So in the words of Kunsang Pelden, the overall content of chapter 4 can be encapsulated by the following words, and I quote, "The present explanation of discipline referring to the explanation in the fourth chapter, is not concerned with the reception of the various vows, nor with their different precepts and the methods of repairing transgressions. Instead, Shantideva discourses upon carefulness, mindfulness, and vigilant introspection, which are the very factors that make the practice of discipline possible. It is essential, he continues, that they be developed through meditation and training in a way that Shantideva describes. For if carefulness is lacking and you simply imprison your body and speech, the vows will be a burden. Why, you might ask? Kunsag Pelden answers, you may put on an act of observing them for a while, but phenomenal appearances are deceptive, and the mind is feckless and weak, and it is very quickly led astray by things and situations. In the end, you will fail. It is vitally important, therefore, to rely upon carefulness and to strive zealously in the practice of discipline, the ground and basis of all spiritual qualities that derive from study, reflection, and meditation upon the teachings. In Nagarjuna's friendly letter, we have the following two verses to exactly the same point. Carefulness is the way to deathlessness, while carelessness is death, the Buddha taught. And thus, so that your virtuous deeds may grow, be careful constantly and with respect. Carefulness is the way of immortality. Carelessness is the way of death. With carefulness, one need not perish. With carelessness, one always dies. End of Nagarjuna's quotes. In summary, we can appreciate that without carefulness, we're prone to pursue the experience of suffering, of death, and rebirth in samsara. Tossed hopelessly in this way, how are we to even begin to consider engaging in the six perfections that exactly encapsulate the engaging aspect of the Bodhisattva path? How are we to nourish the seeds of virtue and eschew the seeds of non-virtue from which spring boundless pain? So in this way, we arrive at chapter 5, which is, to quote Gyaltsab Sabje's heading, explaining the way of training in morality by relating it to introspection and mindfulness, the methods for keeping all virtuous dharmas pure. By way of introduction to this chapter, Geshe Doga quoted from a verse which comes later in chapter 5, which we're now moving on to. And that's verse 23, which says, "Oh, you who wish to guard your minds, I beseech you with folded hands, always exert yourself to guard mindfulness and alertness." The fact that Shantideva is exhorting us in this direct manner indicates how intensely vital it is that we understand how to practice mindfulness and alertness, together with determining the stakes in failing to do so. That we must approach our spiritual practice in this precise and coherent manner is perhaps a shock, or if not a shock, then perhaps an unexpected challenge, because it contravenes the romantic, wistful, fanciful notion that our spiritual practice can be based on sheer faith and will somehow magically, mysteriously, inspirationally achieve its aim by dint of merely wishing or expecting it to do so. We might even call such an appeal to fantastical agency are a form or variety of theism, in that it places the power of transformation beyond or outside ourselves. So this is the antithesis of what Shantideva is asking us to do. This is because we have placed the agency of our problems externally to ourselves. Again, this is the antithesis of the meaning of practicing on the path. So in this context, mindfulness consists of not forgetting those actions that are to be implemented and those that are to be avoided. The emphasis here is on not forgetting. Mindfulness has the aspect of remembering in the current moment, as we know, what was known in the immediately prior moment. And in this way, we establish mindfulness covering a continuity of awareness. The moment we forget to remember, as it were, we fail to be in the presence of what was there a moment before. Therefore, here, we're being asked to apply mindfulness to those in order to be continuously aware of those actions to be adopted and those discarded. To define introspection, Kunzag Pelden says, vigilant introspection or inner watchfulness is a repeated examination of all circumstances. I'll repeat that. A repeated examination of all circumstances, whether we are alone or in the company of others, of our physical, verbal, and mental behavior, and the consciousness and the conscious implementation of the principle of adopting what is to be done and rejecting what is not to be done. So the meaning of these two terms, key terms, will become clearer as we proceed through the chapter. But to recap, if we are to train in the perfections that we have promised when we undertook the Bodhisattva vow, we will need conscientiousness, which Gyaltsabje describes as the limb preventing the degeneration of the training of the mind of enlightenment. So this is, again, referring back to the last chapter. But we also need to understand how to train immorality by relating it to introspection and mindfulness, because these are the methods for keeping, says Gyaltsabje, virtuous dharmas pure. This is because introspection has a function similar to that of a spy. It peeps in on the scene and checks that everything is in the right place, doing the right thing at the right time, and so forth. And so it, in a way, occupies the realm that's been established by the continuity of mindfulness and just checks that nothing's gone out of kilter, nothing's slid out of position, that our virtuous mind or intent hasn't slid into a non-virtuous intent because some affliction has suddenly taken anchor in our mind, for example. So you can appreciate that even at a glance, Shantideva is being absolutely rigorous in anticipating what qualities are required to be developed at each stage of our spiritual development. Moreover, his account coincides with the manner in which we must skillfully approach our own practice so that it might suitably, organically unfold in both experiential and conceptual terms. By conceptual terms here, I mean that our understanding of how our practice is unfolding must be clearly understood by us as well, so that we can anticipate what is to be done next and to leave behind what was to be left behind without any kind of confusion or residue or doubt and so forth. So all of this becomes palpably clear when we observe Gyaltsabje's headings and subheadings for chapter 5. And these will be presented as we go, but to start, Gyaltsabje gives a general presentation which has 3 parts. Having generated the mind, meaning the mind of enlightenment, why it is necessary to cultivate the trainings. Secondly, training in method and wisdom separately will not lead to enlightenment. And thirdly, the sequence of cultivating the trainings. Of the first, Gyaltsabje says, and I quote, merely generating the wish or aspiring mind, of course, has great benefits, but it is impossible to attain enlightenment without making the perfections the essence of one's practice. So I'll repeat that last one because it was important. It is impossible to attain enlightenment without making the perfections the essence of one's practice. End of quote. So this reiterates the point already made about untethered spirituality. Without cultivating the trainings, our so-called practice is a kind of sham. Practice here refers to none other than our actual dynamic engagement with the six perfections. As Kunsang Pelden says, we must first study at the feet of an authentic teacher in order to understand how to train ourselves and become adept in adopting and rejecting. Otherwise, how would we be able to apply it without forgetting? So mindfulness, introspection, and conscientiousness must work in tandem. Moreover, there is a necessary sequence to our training. Gyaltsabje makes it abundantly clear before he launches upon a verse-by-verse commentary of this fifth chapter. And it's perhaps expedient that we attempt to do the same. Gyaltsabje says, merely wishing to generate the mind, aspiring mind of enlightenment has, of course, great benefits, but it is impossible to attain enlightenment without making the perfections of the essence of one's practice. One's effort will also not bring about a result if the engaged method is incomplete, even though it is unmistaken. Therefore, one needs to train in a complete, unmistaken method. So as a scriptural support, Gyaltsabje quotes from the Purification of Varachana, which is, the transcendental wisdom that knows all, the keeper of the secret, arose from the root of compassion, arose from the cause of bodhicitta, is the culmination of method. And Gyaltsabje then goes on to explain the meaning of this quote. He says, as quoted, one goes beyond through great compassion, conventional and ultimate bodhicitta, and the method of generosity and the other perfections. So gone beyond here is referring to reaching the shore of full enlightenment. So this is why, having cultivated the mind of bodhicitta, it is crucially necessary to engage in its pertinent trainings. As Tsongkhapa says, I quote, it is indeed the case that great benefit comes from the mere development of the aspirational spirit of enlightenment. Without learning the trainings of generosity and so forth, however, you still have to practice the Bodhisattva trainings. If you do not emphasize this practice, you will never become a Buddha. And Tsongkhapa quotes from the King of Concentration Sutra, which says, therefore, take practice to heart. Why? O Prince, because when you take practice to heart, perfect enlightenment is not hard to obtain. And Tsongkhapa glosses, practice means the method of achieving Buddhahood, i.e., learning the Bodhisattva's trainings. So Tsongkhapa proposes that trying to achieve enlightenment without undertaking the Bodhisattva's trainings is like trying to milk a horn, like a cow's horn or a yak's horn or whatever, in the hope of extracting milk. Additionally, we must practice all six perfections together, as Tsongkhapa indicates. Because although the six, considered as a set, encapsulate the entirety of the Bodhisattva's practice, the practice of just one single perfection on its own is incomplete, meaning it is an incomplete cause for enlightenment, considered on its own. Tsongkhapa says, you achieve omniscience from a number of causes, each of which is insufficient by itself. And another sort of point of reflection, even before we've cultivated the mind of bodhicitta, we can undertake to engage in a similitude of the six perfections. So there's no point that we can't step out towards that path. Although I can't develop the topic here, Geshe Doga, for his part, recommends that we refer to the extensive Lam Rim presentations to get a detailed account of the six perfections. And he particularly recommends the great treatise, The Stages of the Path by Venerable Lama Tsongkhapa, and specifically for our purposes here, it's volume 2. There we find a presentation of the six perfections in terms of being definite in number from the point of view of higher status, the two purposes, as complete achievement of the welfare of others, of containing all the Mahayana, of the complete path of method, and encapsulating the three higher trainings. Gyaltsabje, for his part, introduces this chapter by presenting a concise account of the six perfections in terms of cause, nature, division, meaning of the name, and the result of the six perfections. So I suggest that it's good for us to explore these headings in some detail in our own time. But for the immediate purposes, the point is that in our current text, Guide to a Bodhisattva's Way of Life, we may see the entire text as a condensation of all of these points and topics, all geared towards our own adoption, our own engaging adoption of all six perfections to the very best of our current capability. We're being urged over and over and over again to set off in that very, very vital and important direction. So in his commentary, Gyaltsabje now shifts to a specific presentation, and he presents two subheadings for our approach to this chapter, explaining the text of the chapter and explaining the name of the chapter. And the first, explaining the text of the chapter, has two subdivisions, explaining extensively how to practice, and the concluding summary, showing that one has to practice the meaning and not just the words. The explaining extensively point has its own four subdivisions: guarding the mind as a method for guarding the training, guarding mindfulness and introspection as methods for guarding the mind, practice of guarding the mind with introspection and mindfulness, and the method for perfecting the trainings. Now, bear with me. Guarding the mind as a method for guarding the training has itself three subdivisions. By protecting the mind, all will be protected. The reason for this, striving in guarding the mind. And the first of these has its own three subdivisions, showing in brief the necessity of protecting one's mind, the fault of generating the mind, and the benefits of protecting the mind. So the first verse of the chapter 5 comes under the first, showing in brief the necessity of protecting one's mind. So you might be wondering, why I've gone to some length to indicate these structural frameworks in Geldsubj's commentary. So I'm just going to ask you a question. Why are these outlines so important and so precious when we approach our study? Anyone got any ideas from your own experience as well? Steve, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ross. Um, well, from my own experience, they kind of help organize the text. They break it into digestible chunks, and then they aid in memorization as well.
Mm-hmm.
So if
Yeah,
you can remember the headings, then that really helps sort of accessing the text.
thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add or to offer? I think that's an excellent account. There's probably just one other feature that I see that the those deep and endlessly refining structures achieving, which is that we're less in danger of leaving something out. And I'm referring here to the wisdom of the lineage that is supporting the commentaries around the root texts. And so we're going to be able to see how a particular verse in a particular chapter of Shantideva relates to a particular point of another point, which then relates to a scope, which then relates back to the general framework of the Lam Rim and so forth. And so in this way, we kind of orchestrate a comprehensive understanding that is incredibly well grounded and orchestrated so that all the parts speak to each other. I just know from my own kind of careless reading habit, which I think we probably all have to some extent, that we kind of rush over a text, and particularly when it's in verse form. How many verses do we digest in a single sitting when we're reading Shantideva, for example? It's like eating lolly into one verse, one verse, one verse, one verse. Each of these verses that I'm attempting to unfold in these classes is worthy of incredibly dedicated focus and attention and contemplation, and even for days or weeks, in fact. And the connection between the verses is absolutely critical to understand. The argumentative logic of Shantideva is so persuasive, so uniquely persuasive, that it's an incredible treasure to come into contact with a text of this nature. So these structures are memory aids, as Stephen mentioned, in a very, very important way. So the first heading we're going to deal with now is showing in brief the necessity of protecting one's mind, and that's referring to the first verse of the chapter. Those who wish to guard their practice should very attentively guard their minds. For those who do not guard their minds will be unable to guard their practice. For those who are not able to guard their minds will be unable to guard their practice. This might seem like a truism, but it isn't at all, because it's so incredibly difficult to guard one's practice in this way. Just look at the evidence of our own current minds. To swing this back to the general topic of the chapter, without the rope of mindfulness and introspection as its protector, we'll be incapable of implementing, let alone persevering in our practice. We'll be like that proverbial parrot mouthing the words of Dharma while disporting ourselves in a manner divorced from its meaning. This is why we should attentively guard our minds, very attentively guard our minds, because without such guard, our practice itself will be unprotected and prone to decay, if not total collapse. We know the feeling of such collapse when even a few moments of powerful anger come into play within our mind. In that instant, we become capable of violent acts that totally betray contravene and betray our Bodhisattva promise to not only not harm others, but to actively work for their benefit in every conceivable way. Likewise, if we don't vigilantly protect our minds, our vows and commitments will become remote from us. We may even abandon them. In other words, we are to zealously guard our minds by employing the watchdog of attentiveness, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama puts it, as this will prevent us from doing anything negative, says His Holiness, while at the same time keeping us mindful of positive actions so that our bodhicitta activities increase and we are able to develop bodhicitta in all circumstances. Amazing, isn't it? In all circumstances. His Holiness indicates in his commentary on this verse that while the monastic and lay rules of the Vinaya predominantly involve discipline of physical actions and speech, the Bodhisattva's discipline requires something greater. One is, quote, to avoid any selfish attitude whatsoever, as this is the only in this way can one ensure that one will act in a manner that is not to be, quote, at the expense of others. His Holiness says, of course our body and speech are involved, but we are concerned here mainly with the mind. It is within this context that a Bodhisattva, whose mind is clear, stable, and completely under control, is able to work for the benefit of others in ways that might otherwise produce harm. The main discipline, therefore, concerns wrongdoing of the mind. So in particular, this verse refers to the special, or rather the essential need to safeguard our Bodhisattva vows. Why? Because our practice of the Bodhisattva vehicle is dependent upon exactly that. We notice that the introductory verse is structured according to a forward pervasion, first of all. Those who wish to guard their practice should very attentively guard their minds. And then it's immediately followed by a reverse pervasion. For those who do not guard their minds will be unable to guard their practice. So this creates a scenario where the implications of two divergent or antithetical decisions is rendered palpable. We either guard our minds or decide to guard our minds, or we don't. There is no intermediate position, no middling stance here, no compromise whatsoever. Thus, our need to make a decisive resolve is abundantly clear. We either allow our minds to wander off to what Gyaltsabje identifies as mistaken objects, or we don't. There's a critical distinction to be made here. Geshe Doga indicates that it's between protecting or guarding the mind and restraining the mind. Restraining the mind means to make the effort from the very beginning not to allow our mind to become influenced by the delusions. Protecting the mind, on the other hand, means to take notice when the mind is being influenced by the delusions, at which point one immediately applies antidotes to turn the mind away from them. So this is really, really crucial. So in our current context, the emphasis is on the second, perhaps, protecting the mind. This is because if we don't protect the mind by seeing the needs to apply the antidotes at a suitable time, such as when we're in the midst of the rising of affliction, we'll be unable to engage in virtuous objects or virtuous pursuits, such as the six perfections. This is because we have allowed our mind to become waylaid or even sabotaged by the unopposed manifest delusions themselves. We're letting them run their course. And thus they'll be effectively allowed to overwhelm and conquer us. How can we then be said to be engaged in our practice? As Gyaltsab says, quote, if one does not protect the mind from wandering off, it becomes impossible to protect the trainings. So this is a very significant point. By not protecting our mind, we are unable to protect our engagement with the practice of the six perfections themselves. This is the essential thrust of the verse, and the next verse will make this even more abundantly clear. It's under the heading, the fault of degenerating the mind. And the second verse reads, in this world, unsubdued and crazed elephants are incapable of causing such harms as the miseries of the deepest hell, which can be caused by the unleashed elephant of my mind. So note that this metaphorical elephant, already mightily powerful, is even more dangerous because it has been unleashed. It's been allowed to run rogue, allowed to run wild. So if we apply the metaphor to our own mind, such elephant-like abandonment of taking responsibility for what's occurring in our mind is the very opposite of protection, because we've allowed the deluded mind the scope to go on a dangerous and destructive rampage. Again, Shantideva employs an immediate dialectical contrast, reverse pervasion again, as it were. He flips the situation around. He says, but if the elephant of my mind is firmly bound on all sides by the rope of mindfulness, all fears will cease to exist and all virtues come into my hand. I'll read that again. It's such a beautiful verse, isn't it? But if the elephant of my mind is firmly bound on all sides by the rope of mindfulness, all fears will cease to exist and all virtues will come into my hand. So if we pursue the metaphor of the elephant a little more closely, we can appreciate that my unrestrained mind, due to my habituation with non-virtue and distraction in the past, and my craving for sensual satisfaction in the future, and also my obsessive preoccupation with myself in the present, my self-cherishing self, is indeed effectively unrestrained. It roams wherever it impulsively, deliriously wants to go, leaving a trampled landscape in its wake. I use those words deliberately because I just know in my own experience that for some reason my ability to control my afflicted mind has sort of not been in place or has failed, and anger has arisen and I've acted out of anger, I am then left to contemplate a ruined path in the wake of that mind of anger. I can't restore the damage. It has been done. I can only look at the sort of ruins and shambles that lie in its wake. So this is equivalent to the loss of one's vows. It's said that if one loses one's vows, one is bereft in the most extraordinary way because one has let go of the most precious thing one has ever held. So maintaining this mind of virtue is so critical. As Kunsang Pelden says, left running to its own devices, it accumulates, the mind meaning, it accumulates bad karma, which in future lives will result in the intense pain of being roasted or boiled in unrelenting pain and other hells. He mentions that in India, elephants were used for military purposes. They were maddened with alcohol and unleashed against the enemy, whose towns they were able to reduce to absolute ruin. And he adds a critical caveat, quote, even so, they were powerless to inflict on sentient beings any harm comparable to the hell of unrelenting pain. Therefore, every effort should be made to control the mind. So the point he's making there is that an elephant can only crush a person in this one lifetime, whereas our unrestrained, afflicted mind is able to destroy our happiness for many, many lifetimes ahead, and also destroy the happiness of countless others. In the third verse, which comes under the heading of the benefits of protecting the mind, we're supplied with the tools needed to tame this elephant, namely binding it from all sides with the rope of mindfulness. This is like planting a giant and deep stake in the ground. Mindfulness is the actual mode of tethering to our chosen anchor spot, which is none other, according to this analogy, than correct mental behavior, that concordant with the Bodhisattva's way of life. We're trying to anchor ourselves to that with the rope of mindfulness. In this way, we're following past habituated habits and experience, roaming deliriously or even wading in fantasies of future sensual fulfillment, straying to the conditions of the present merely because they're presented to us in our current deluded state as somehow attractive or meaningful, so much so that we have to dedicate ourselves to them and hold on to them. So from this perspective, one should never let one's mindfulness, says Gyaltsab, of the virtuous object to generate. Never let one's mindfulness of the virtuous object degenerate. This mention of virtuous objects degenerating is very poignant because from a bodhisattva's unique perspective, any state of mind that is not actively seeking to progress along the path is an example of degeneration, even if such states are applauded and are revered according to the sort of systems and expectations of ordinary worldly mentalities. In brief, by being mindful, therefore, we ensure that we remain in contact with virtuous objects, not just when in meditation, but 24 hours a day. The implication, and this is drawn out by Geshe Dogen in his commentary, we are then extracting the full essence of this precious human rebirth. And as a boon, sort of a side benefit, if you like, an uncalled for benefit, one's going to happen anyway because of the conditions being set up, we'll find our mind is protected from present and future harms and sufferings. So we now move to the extensive presentation. But if the elephant of my mind is firmly bound, as Shantideva is going to present in the next two chapters, we will find that all of these problems of uncontrolled minds will collapse. In the fourth verse, Shantideva says, tigers, lions, elephants, bears, snakes, and all forms of enemies, the guardians of the hell worlds, evil spirits, and cannibals will be bound by binding my mind alone, and will be subdued by subduing my mind alone. Berzin notes that the source in these verses appears to be the Ratnamiga Sutra, which says, if control is gained over my mind alone, control will be gained over everything. And both unwholesome and wholesome actions are accumulated by the mind. So the logic here is anticipating the famous, very famous forthcoming stanza, number 13 in our chapter. I'll just quote it now because it does really exemplify the points that are being made. Where could I possibly find enough leather with which to cover the surface of the earth? But wearing leather just on the soles of my feet is equivalent to covering the earth with it. So although this is an exemplification of the power of patience, the perfection of patience, it's really showing you that by having mindfulness and introspection in place, we're protecting the entire ground of our practice. Regarding the role of the mind as the creator of everything, Kabje Zopa Rinpoche says, our kind, compassionate guru, Shakyamuni Buddha, advised to not commit any unwholesome action, engage in perfect wholesome action, which means to abandon harmful actions, that which is harmful to oneself, especially to other sentient beings, and to engage in the perfect beneficial action that is beneficial towards oneself and especially beneficial to other sentient beings. And the way Rinpoche goes on to explain, to do this is by subduing one's own mind. Rinpoche says to do all this from one's own mind by understanding, by recognizing that all the suffering comes from one's own mind, that there is no outside creator of one's own problems, that other than oneself, other than one's own mind, there is no separate creator outside which creates your problems, except one's own mind. Instead of making one's own mind independent, free, we let it be controlled by the disturbing thoughts, by the delusions. So this mind controlled by delusions, anger, ignorance, attachment, these three principal disturbing thoughts, then those other disturbing thoughts, and karma motivated by these disturbing thoughts, these are what creates or produces our sufferings. So Rinpoche continues, by subduing the mind, abandoning the harmful actions, harmful to oneself, other sentient beings, and obtaining or engaging in beneficial actions towards oneself and towards other sentient beings, this is something which one does with freedom, with one's own freedom, by knowing, with this wisdom that everything is dependent on one's own mind, that your mind is the source of all the happiness and all the source of all the problems, depending on what one does with one's mind, whether one takes care of one's mind or not. So that's it in a nutshell. If we control our mind, not only all internal enemies, but also all external enemies and threats will be overcome. So these external enemies and threats, and also the embodiment of internal enemies and threats, have been captured by Shantideva in these verses through his animal images, sort of fearsome animal images of tigers, lions, elephants, bears, and snakes, etc. By binding one sole thing, our mind, with a rope of mindfulness, we can control all malevolent forces. But also, and this is as important in Shantideva's presentation as in Rinpoche's presentation, on the positive side, we are then also free to produce the virtuous minds that, let alone that alone ensure success. Again, we can apply this to our emotional states and also to our external reality. So this invokes the role of karma, of course, which is a topic that can't be understood at a glance. But Gyaltsabje says, stopping the cause for any threat in this way solely by fastening the mind with a rope of mindfulness completely to a virtuous meditation object equals binding all dangers, and one will not be harmed in the least. Solely subduing the mind with mindfulness and introspection, and thus stopping engagement in negative actions, equals subduing all dangers. Therefore, one should strive in subduing the mind. In short, no harm can befall one who practices ethics purely and responsibly. Gyaltsabje now presents the reasons for this under two subdivisions. Faults depend upon the mind, and qualities depend upon the mind. And in regards to faults depending on the mind, Shantideva speaks to this point by quoting the Buddha as an authentic source to validate this very, very subtle point. Verse 6 says, the perfect teacher himself has shown that in this way all fears as well as all boundless miseries originate from the mind. And Gyaltsabje, in his commentary of this verse, quotes from the Sutra of Clouds of Jewels, which says, whether it is virtue or non-virtuous karma, it is accumulated by the mind. And also, all phenomena depend on the mind. So the Buddha is a perfectly reliable voice of authority because, as Gyaltsabje says, he is the able one who explained faultlessly and perfectly all objects of knowledge. End of quote. So the second subdivision, faults depend upon the mind, is now given. And we're looking at the reason. 7, who intentionally created all the weapons for those in hell? Who created the burning iron ground? From where did all the women in hell ensue? And 8ab, the Mighty One has said that all such things are the workings of an evil mind. So Shantideva's exploitation or sort of employment of powerful rhetorical questioning is again foregrounded. It is we who are to resolve these questions. Thus, it's not just a matter of understanding and accepting external authority. We must deeply divine the reasons for our answer to these questions from deep within ourselves. And if we fail to do this, we've failed already, of course, to recognize the fundamental point of the investigation, that it is our mind that is responsible for everything we meet. This is because it is either intentionally or willfully subdued or unsubdued, points that we've made earlier. In other words, have we given full rein to the workings of our own evil mind? I think evil here can be, it's a difficult word, isn't it? It carries some sort of cultural baggage, but I think here we have to include all mental actions that result in suffering. It would therefore include both self-grasping and self-cherishing minds. I wanted to mention Shantideva's reference to women here in the fourth line of the verse, at least in the Bachelor's translation, because I think if it's read sort of superficially or carelessly, could be interpreted as misogynistic. The scriptural reference that Shantideva is employing is also found in the Lamrim teachings, where those who have engaged in particularly severe lustful attraction to a woman, as given in the example of the Lamrim text, result in sexual misconduct, leads one to be reborn in a hell where, and I quote Geshe-Doga here, one would have visions of women on top of a cliff calling out to you. As you hear the sirens beckoning, you try to climb up the mountain, but there are downward facing swords that cut you. Then, having reached the top, you hear the sirens beckoning from you from the ground. And when you try to go down, the swords are facing up at you, and again you are pierced by them. So Geshe-Doga explains that such suffering experiences arise from an hallucination that someone is calling you. He points out how our self-projected scenarios can appear, such self-projected scenarios can appear so vividly even in our dreams. So he takes this as an analogy for the way in which we can pictorialize, if you like, a kind of a hellish landscape through the act of mental projection. So the point is not that women have a special role to play as hell-being temptresses, which is certainly an archetype with multiple threads in social history, particularly within the context of patriarchal cultures, but that one will meet with the conditions that correspond to the manner of the actions that have led to that outcome karmically. So in this way, we can see that the hell realm being depicted is a grotesque, rebounding, hallucinatory-like mirror replying to the act of non-virtue, of, in this case, maybe a man who abuses or rapes and so forth. So women who kill out of lust might meet a male hell-being tormentor, according to this logic, instead. The underlying point is still intact. Shantideva is illustrating that there is no other cause or creator of such things other than being the consequences of one's own mind. His Holiness has mentioned, he mentions from time to time in different commentaries actually, that he's aware that some feminists call out Shantideva for misogyny because of references like this. And as a consequence, they either don't engage with the text or they vehemently dismiss them. But he feels that that is a mistake. He then adds that Shantideva was assuming an ordained male audience in the context of classical India, with its caste system, its privileging of male kings and princes, male heirs, and so forth. Hence, the images conjured in Shantideva's poetry are designed or tailored to speak to those dwelling within that classical Indian ethos. So I think, given that, we need to do a little bit of our own cultural work, if you like, to dislocate the charge against Shantideva that might otherwise be rendered here. So it's worth mentioning that in the Padmakara translation of the same verse, we have the hellish whips to torture living beings. Who has made them and to what intent? Who has forged this burning iron ground? Whence have all these demon women sprung? Hence, In their translation, they've also left the female demoness image intact, but the translators there relate it in a footnote to its source in the scriptural teachings on the hell realms. And that's the account of the clambering up and down a tree covered in knives and so forth that I've just quoted. So I'll leave this topic here, but to boil it all down, the overriding point here is that the fires of hell are only mere appearances due to previous negative karmas. In stating this, we are removing causality from an omnipotent agency, such as a creator God or any other external source. Geshe Doga illustrates the power of the mind in this regard by recounting the very, very famous story of three beings who see the same object differently. One sees pus in that place, one sees water, and one sees nectar. This example is given an extensive commentary in Kadrup's Dose of Emptiness for those who are wishing to investigate. There, Kadrup indicates that not seeing something is not equivalent to saying that it does not exist. Just because a human sees water and a predator sees pus does not mean that pus and water don't functionally appear to both of those beings due to their karmic dispositions. So we can also, I'm just extending here, relate this to the ordinary sensorium of animals. A fly sees steaming hot feces as delightfully fragrant food and a safe nesting place in which to deposit their eggs. Kabje Rinpoche says, when we dream of being in a certain country or a beautiful house or a suffering, dirty place, it's not that someone has created these places for us. It's a karmic vision of our own mind. It's the same with the experiences of the hell beings, the red hot ground, the windowless houses, the pots of boiling water, and so forth. They're all karmic visions that are the results of karma, created out of delusion in previous lives. So this topic of karmic vision is very, very pertinent to our current topic under investigation. How is the mind the creator of everything? I think I've got a car revving in the garage next door. I don't know if you can hear it or not, but that's the sound. So I'm just going to do a little bit of side work here. We're not saying that the mind is the substantial cause of matter, for example. It cannot be, because this would require that matter and consciousness pertain to the same continuum, which they cannot, as this would require consciousness to be material and matter to be conscious. As His Holiness says, the four subtle particles of the four internal elements are utterly incongruent with the nature of consciousness and thus cannot be the substantial causes of consciousness. As stated in Bhava Vika's Heart of the Middle Way, quote, the characteristics of cognition are not congruent with the elements, so how could it arise from them? End of quote. But how, this is the point, how matter appears, how it's apprehended, is dependent upon our own designating mind. It's sending out of a label, etc., that sticks to the base and is read back due to innate self-grasping ignorance as the objective reality of the thing out there in the very spot where it appears to be, covering the base of designation and so forth. Returning to our commentary in the second part of verse 8, hence, within the three world spheres, there is nothing to fear other than my own mind. Gyaltsabje considers this a summary of the verse that immediately preceded. He says, since all faults arise from mind, all three realms are created by one's mind. There is no danger apart from this. So considering our situation in this way is actually very profound because it mitigates against the easy or even lazy notion that we somehow tumble like a newborn baby into one of the three realms that is already established there, as though sitting waiting for us. We also consider samsara to somehow be a pre-existent objective environment in this way, in which we get to be reborn. So it sort of becomes a habitat almost. But this is not at all the case. Samsara, with its three realms, is none other than being forced to take on the burden of the afflicted aggregates again and again, due to the 12 links of independent origination, starting with the first link, ignorance. As Kabje Zopa Rinpoche says, the city is not samsara. The mountains are not samsara. The fields, the farm are not samsara. Cars are not samsara. So what is samsara? Samsara is this consciousness, this mind, which experiences so much suffering. This is samsara. The body, which experiences so many problems. This is samsara. Now, the association of the mind and the body, that which is the container of all the problems, that feels hunger, thirst, hot and cold, which experiences all these problems. This is what is called samsara in English, meaning circling. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama spells out the fundamental implication of this presentation. His Holiness says, we see that the causes of dukkha, dissatisfactoriness, if you like, arise within us. So release or relief from dukkha must also be accomplished within our own mind. No miraculous drug can stop the cycle of rebirth, nor can cryonics conquer death. The only way to the deathless state, nirvana, is by eliminating the cause of samsaric rebirth. End of quote. So again, we're returned to confront face to face the fact that within the three samsaric realms, there is nothing to fear other than one's own mind, as Shantideva so aptly puts it. Our obfuscating, afflicted mind, that is, because it is this that is the root of all our problems. Gyaltsabje's next heading, qualities depend on the mind. So you notice that this is sharply juxtaposed with the last heading, which said that faults depend on the mind. So qualities here referring to good qualities, virtuous qualities. So this is entirely the optimistic part of the causal equation. And I'm really stressing we must need to keep this optimistic side of the causal equation also constantly in focus. Otherwise we'll become lopsided and perhaps a little bewildered or depressed. It's not the purpose of these teaching whatsoever. It's to take responsibility in a very, very skillful way so that we ensure the circumstances of happiness and fulfillment. So if our mind is the source of all faults of samsara, equally, it is the source of all liberative momentum. This is definitely the case if we engage in the six perfections, as then we not only attain liberation, but freedom from all states of obscuration. In this manner, we transform ourselves, or can transform ourselves, into a wish-fulfilling jewel on behalf of all other suffering mothers. As Kunu Lama says, a jewel mine, a wish-fulfilling cow, a bench to stop and rest for those who tread the path, more excellent than the finest medicine, bodhicitta is proclaimed supreme. So in order to appreciate the mind of bodhicitta in terms of its amplitude, its immense beneficial scale, Gyaltsabje gives us a series of subheadings that pinpoint the nature of the qualities that are being referred to here. Firstly, generosity depends on the mind. Morality depends on the mind. Patience depends on the mind. Enthusiasm depends on the mind. Mental stabilization depends on the mind. Wisdom depends on the mind. So you can see here we have an enumeration of the 6 perfections. So to actually engage in these six perfections, 3 conditions are to be met. Our motivation must be one of bodhicitta. We must seal it with a realization of emptiness. And we must profoundly dedicate our action towards the accomplishment of complete enlightenment. Even if we attempt to practice in this way, by including the 3 conditions, we'll be capable of pursuing a similitude of the perfections. So we mightn't have actual bodhicitta, but we might really, really wish to have actual bodhicitta. So we dedicate this towards achieving full enlightenment. We might yet be waiting to have a realization of emptiness, or particularly a direct realization of emptiness, but we wish to have a realization of emptiness in order to be able to reach our goal of full enlightenment for the benefit of others and to remove our own afflictions from their source within our own mental continuum so that we're free to do this. So, put another way, we must proceed from where we currently stand on the basis of love and compassion and whatever understanding of reality we can muster. Without considering our situation in this very accessible manner, the mind of enlightenment itself might somehow appear to be remote in the distance, because we see it as so far away from where we currently are. So I just wanted to mention here in Geshe-Doge's commentary that he boiled down these points to love and compassion via a story of Khenso Kangura Rinpoche, one of the great abbots of Serajay Monastery. Just days before Kangura Rinpoche manifested passing. And when he went into Rinpoche's room, Geshe-Doga was asked what his main practice was. So this is a so-called dying Lama with razor-sharp mind asking a high Geshe coming into the room, what's your main practice? Hurling it out across the room. And Geshe-Doga replied, I'll say it in Geshe-Doga's words, I spent about an hour with him listening and talking when he asked me what I'm meditating on these days. And I said, I take love and compassion as my main practice. And then we had a discussion for about an hour. Rinpoche said, oh, that is a simple practice. Even lay people, elderly people who are not monks and nuns would practice that. And Geshe-Doga reflected, perhaps Khenso Rinpoche was expecting me to give a much more profound answer. So when he questioned me further, I said I felt that I encompass a lot of other practices into this practice. Of course, I was sharing what I truly believe. And indeed, when we train our mind more and more on love and compassion, every time we generate that mind, it brings us closer to enlightenment. So this is why I see it as an essential practice. So in his own commentary on these current verses, Geshe-Doga adds the 3 main conditions that help to subdue the mind. So we haven't lost our topic here at all, we're still there. The 3 main conditions that help to subdue the mind are love, compassion, and concentration, meditative stabilization. So we can take these three as our essential practices. Then there is no question that we can work towards subduing the mind. So we might sort of note here that mental stabilization not only works towards against uncontrollable distraction, but it is a precondition for special insight meditation through which we'll eventually gain a non-conceptual meditative equipoise on emptiness, at which point we begin to cut the afflictions from their root. So I'll just add something here from Geshe Nawandagi. If we develop our realization of emptiness to the degree that it becomes non-conceptual, it immensely facilitates our practice of generosity. This is swinging us right back to Shantideva's chapter. Geshe Nawandagi says, as happens with highly realized listeners and self-evolving beings, discordant appearances disappear completely from the face of their total absorption on this absence of true existence, and they behold the sphere of reality encompassing everything. The discordant appearances of true existence return when they arise from their absorption, but with their subsequent realization, they see that they are like illusions and no longer react with ideologically based disturbing attitudes or grasping. This, and this is the key, this acts as a great spur to their far-reaching attitude of giving, and consequently, their practice of generosity becomes extremely broad. End of quote. So reading this back the other way, we can appreciate that for as long as we continue to uphold things, in this case, the giver, object given, and the recipient, as truly existent, for that long, we'll face disturbing restrictions surrounding the notion of giving something precious away, such as our current body. And we can count or recall here the very famous example of Shakyamuni Buddha in former life as a bodhisattva, giving away his body to a tigress so that she could feed her starving cubs, as recounted so movingly in the Golden Light Sutra. Gyaltsabje's next subhead indicates that verse 9 is deeply concerned with how generosity depends on the mind. And this heading subdivided. Firstly, completing the practice, perfection of generosity, does not depend on eliminating the poverty of all transmigrators. And secondly, it is perfected through the acquaintance with the mind of giving. Verse 9 reads, if the perfection of generosity, and there's a big if there, if the perfection of generosity were the alleviation of the world's poverty, then since beings are still starving now, in what manner did the previous Buddhas perfect it? So this verse addresses a fundamental doubt that might arise if we consider the perfection of generosity to mean that all beings acquire exactly what they need, such as food, etc., as a consequence of our practice of perfection. But to consider the perfection in this way is a misinterpretation, a misunderstanding. Gyaltsabje paraphrases the meaning of Shantideva's verse. If it were necessary to eliminate the poverty of all sentient beings to complete the perfection of generosity, then since impoverished migrators still exist, how could the generosity gone beyond exist? How could the previous Buddha protectors possibly have completed the perfection of generosity? It would be impossible. Shantideva himself immediately answers this doubt with verse 10. The perfection of generosity is said to be the thought to give all beings everything, together with the fruit of such a thought. Hence, it is simply a state of mind. Perhaps this comes as a revelation to us. What does it mean to say that the perfection of generosity is simply a state of mind? Does it somehow belittle the notion of something like generosity, in this case, reaching perfection? To the contrary, if perfected generosity meant that every being was satiated with material objects they'd been given by a bodhisattva, then how come, as Shantideva was asked earlier, would there be poverty and suffering in the world? This would be a direct contradiction of the notion of a perfection itself. Tsongkhapa also directly addresses this point by his own account of these two verses of Shantideva. He says, bringing the perfection of generosity to completion is not contingent on removing beings' poverty by giving gifts to others. Otherwise, since there still remain many destitute living beings, all the earlier conquerors would not have attained generosity. Therefore, the physical and verbal aspects of generosity are not the main thing. The main thing is the mental aspect. This is because, Tsongkhapa talking, this is because you perfect generosity after you destroy your stingy clinging to all that you own, your body, resources, and roots of virtue. And you completely condition your mind to giving them away to living beings from the depths of your heart. And not only that, but also to giving others the effects of this giving as well. So even the benefits of giving, you immediately give away. You don't keep anything for yourself. And Tsongkhapa then, from the Lamrit Chenmo, the great treatise, quotes verses 9 and 10 from Shantideva's chapter. If generosity were perfected by removing beings' poverty, since beings are still destitute, how could past saviors have perfected it? Generosity is perfected, it is said, through the attitude of giving away to all beings, all your possessions, along with the effects of this. Therefore, generosity is a state of mind. Tsongkhapa concludes his commentary. Thus, the practice of the perfection of generosity entails generating in various ways the intention to give and steadily increasing this generosity, even though you may not be actually giving away something to others. End of quote. So this last statement is particularly significant because it is not the case that if it was the case that generosity was the material act of giving and not the intention to give, then renunciates who have surrendered all their physical possessions to live an ascetic lifestyle could not practice and attain such a perfection, as they have nothing in their hand to hold, to offer, other than perhaps a cracked, stained begging bowl. So Tsongkhapa is also indicating that destroying stinginess in regards to our body and resources does not in itself constitute the perfection of generosity. Why not? Because stinginess, says Tsongkhapa, is included within attachment. And so even the two kinds of Hinayana arhats have totally eliminated it along with its seeds. So what's required, therefore? Tsongkhapa says, what is required is that you not only clear away, and I love the word in here, stinginess's tight-fistedness, which prevents giving things away, but also that you develop from the depths of your heart the intent to give away to others all your possessions. From this, you have to meditate on the faults of holding onto things and the benefits of giving them away. So Tsongkhapa then quotes from the Compendium of the Perfections to scripturally endorse this point. And these are very powerful verses, so I'll take the liberty of quoting them today. If you see the impermanence of resources and naturally have great compassion, you will know with good reason that the gifts you have kept in your house belong to others. There is never fear from what has been given away. What is kept at home gives rise to fears. That it is insufficient, ordinary, or needing constant protection, if you give it away, these fears never harm you. And moving a little along, the wise praise giving wealth away. Childish persons like to hoard it. No wealth is kept by holding on to it. From giving it away, excellence always arises. By giving things away, you no longer grasp the afflictions. Beings miserly feed afflictions on a noble path. Noble beings say generosity is the best path, which is opposite to a bad path. So I might stop the presentation here because Shantideva is going to move through the qualities of the perfections in a sort of concise verse form. So it becomes quite a comprehensive topic. But I would open up now to any discussion or reflections or questions, and they can also pertain to last week if you wish. So whatever thoughts are arising, it'd be nice to share them so we can have a chat together. Thank you. Stephen.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Ross, for such a wonderful presentation that you just gave us. I had, I had some thoughts about last week's class as well.
Mm-hmm.
And they had to do with kind of really taking responsibility and owning our own negative mental states
Mm-hmm.
and viewing them as the enemy, really personalizing them.
Yeah.
But again, these are mental states that arise due to our tendencies over a great length of time, and they arise in our own minds and affect our own behavior. So how does one take responsibility and develop that kind of attitude of sort of aggressively addressing them? How does one do that without beating oneself up and saying, "Oh, I'm just the most horrible person, and I keep having these mental states, and I can't seem to get them under control"? How do you avoid falling to that side of the
there's actually a
equation?
lot of questions buried there. I just sort of immediate thought is His Holiness's advice regarding that situation is to be incredibly gentle with yourself. He talks about compassion for oneself and to allow oneself to take time. Because if we measure I mentioned this, I think, a few weeks ago, if we attempt to measure our development, our so-called spiritual development, against yesterday's self, as you're suggesting, we might come a real cropper because lo and behold, it's worse than the day before. We're suddenly surrendered to a whole lot of yuck stuff going on in our minds, and it can be bewildering and sort of cause us to be disconsolate and kind of even depressed. But that's because our time frame is too tight. It's the reality of the familiarization being so powerfully embedded that it will be frequent, that those occurrences will appear almost as though effortlessly when certain circumstances are met. So we don't beat ourselves up about that. We acknowledge that that's the power of familiarization from our past person. One of the things that hit me very, very powerfully when I came into contact with my teachers in this lifetime was Geshe Doga starting off one of his first discourses in the West saying, "You must thank your past person for being here today, listening to the Dharma." And that was the most remarkable thing to think about, this idea of thanking one's own past person. And that does answer your question. you are able to contemplate these topics. You are attempting to sieve and separate virtuous from non-virtuous minds. Even that undertaking, the awareness of that undertaking, is already a unique stance of great power and potential benefit, and not to lose sight of how incredibly precious it is, along with your current precious human rebirth. You've got these ingredients already here. So it's the perfect time to allow those negative minds to become visible in your meditation, if you like, and to look at their aspects without personalizing them. One of the problems here, I think, particularly for Western practitioners, is that we try to marry our notion of self identity with a notion of a real personality that we have. And that real personality itself needs investigation, because in a very important way, we are over emphasizing the integrity of our character, our personality, because we're grasping it as truly existent. So that's why I gave the example last week of if a person's habitually angry a lot of the time, we see them coming towards us, we point and we go, oh, you angry person. We've totalized the identity of that person as angry. That's not the case. Exactly the same with myself. If I become angry and I start thinking, oh, look, I'm just an angry person, I'm totalizing myself as really, truly underneath it all, when all said and done, an angry person who I pretend not to be. That isn't the case. We're simply observing the ripening of a delusion and these sort of supporting circumstances of karmic vision and conditions and so forth. So thinking in that way helps us separate our notion of a viable self, a good, healthy, viable self, a functioning self that can practice, and the kind of self that's got intricately bound up in the sort of definitional impulses of the afflictions themselves, in the sense that we read them as statements about our actual nature, our true nature. So I think I mentioned last week this the famous reference in Shantideva's blame. You don't getting beaten by an assailant with a stick. You don't blame the stick. You blame the assailant wielding the stick. And the logic there is typical Shantideva logic. Yes, but you don't blame the person wielding the stick either. You blame the afflicted mind wielding the person as a weapon to perform harm. So to answer your question, take 2 or 3 steps back and work on the affliction as an affliction, and which can be remedied, definitely remedied in a variety of ways, and apply those remedies in a skillful fashion, and not be too anxious about whether it's working or not, because the remedies definitely work. And His Holiness says we need to judge across a span of time, such as 20 years ago I started to practice patience. Am I now a more patient person? That is the scale of testing whether or not our meditation on the perfection of patience has worked, or is working even a little bit. Does that help? So would anyone else like to contribute? It's a really important topic, isn't it? I know Lama Yeshe often said that one of the things that struck him was the self-doubt and even self-loathing that was so endemic in the Western people he met. He really noticed it. And so many of Lama Yeshe's discourses, we know when we read them, are geared towards building up people's sense of worthiness in order that they might then begin to consider how they might be able to transform their circumstances in a creative way with their Dharma practice. And His Holiness recently, as we know, gave extensive teachings on Buddha nature for exactly the same reason. This Christmas in Dharamsala. Chosang? Yeah.
It's a different question. Is that okay? Or are we out
Oh,
of
of
time?
course. No, I think we can move on. We've got time.
Okay. I think one of my biggest struggles, and you talked about it a bit tonight, is this vigilance and being aware of when I'm totally distracted and lazy and going in this direction, but I really wanted to go over there. And sometimes when I meditate, I sometimes get this lifting feeling, like part of me is rising up, and it's always out this side of my head. I guess I'm having illusions, or delusions, but it's actually a very good feeling. It feels like it's a more aware part of me. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, I can sort of understand that. I think it's because you're letting go of holding on to your immediate body and mind. Actually, you're loosening, letting go, and in that freedom, your proprioceptive consciousness as to where your body is in relation to the universe and where your mind is in relation to your body can sort of shift.
Yes.
And so I think it's not in itself, that shift in itself isn't meaningful, but the relaxation and the openness that you're affording yourself by engendering that experience through meditation is very valuable, because it's getting back to Stephen's question. It gives you a kind of a wider perspective to begin to work on your understanding and your investigation of things, in particularly with analytical meditation. So
is there something I should do when I get into that state?
It is a good time to do your practices. So obviously you might want to send out love to someone in particular, or to a group of beings who are particularly suffering at the moment, and seeing how you can actually perform the perfections while in meditation. So you might want to select one and work with it deliberately, and just see if there's a qualitative difference.
Okay.
So, but the lamas are always saying, I'm not a lama, but I know the lamas always say that if you try to grasp that state and achieve it again and again every time you meditate, you'll come a cropper, because it becomes a form of cropper, meaning you fall over.
Oh.
Cropper is it's maybe an Australian thing. You're sort of walking along and you hit a stone, you go plunk. That's coming a cropper. Okay. So what I'm getting at there is that you become attached to the experience.
No, I don't feel that.
If that was to happen, that is a problem.
Okay.
So you don't expect it. But if it arises, work with it. Work with whatever circumstances arising. And it's wonderful you're having those alternative and differing kinds of experiences, because we're so habituated to the way things are and holding on to it as the real, that it's radical to begin to see something from a new perspective.
Yeah.
And if we look at this from a more subtle tantric viewpoint, of course, we can say that the relationship of the mind and the body isn't quite as not reducible to gross physical bodies and gross minds either. So at death time, for example, our subtle mind leaves our body of this lifetime. So a meditator can explore those sorts of states in meditation as well, and work with them in a dynamic way, using the constellation of the subtle body and its chakras and drops and so forth. So these are all within the tantric teaching. So they're there within the tradition in a very comprehensive and important way. Yeah.
Thank you.
Jay.
Yeah, I've got two questions, one of which goes back to last week. There's a quote: "There's no real reason whatsoever. It's laughable, if not tragic. Our suffering is the result of a fundamental error, but one that could be easily," this was the word that caught me, "thoroughly rectified, namely by generating wisdom. So this is dispel all fears, as Shantideva says. Now, please, sir, tell me how to easily get to wisdom, please." They all come a cropper, and I know what it means.
Yeah, no, I think one has to proceed a little bit cautiously here. All the problems in all their excruciatingly diverse, multiform ways are the result of a single problem, ultimately, which is this grasping at things in an appropriate manner as inherently existent and so forth. And so if we can train our mind in recognize, as Tsongkhapa so beautifully presents, recognizing how things appear inappropriately to innate self-grasping, and then searching deeply to find out whether we can find, in our case, an inherent existent I within our aggregates. When we come to the conclusion that that I can't be found whatsoever, that bare vacuity that is a non-affirming negative is said to be the emptiness of a self, a person. So it's a very precise and, in a way, scientific technique for zeroing in on the error. And because the technique is based on logic and reason, in this case, it's irrefutably effective. It will definitely work if we undergo the procedures, the logical procedure of the meditation. So we think of Tsongkhapa's presentation of the 4 essential points. We identify what it is that we're refuting, then it's going to either exist with the body and mind or other than the body and mind, and there's no other alternative. We then search for it within the body and mind, and then we search for it without the body and mind, and then we come to the absolutely convinced conclusion that it can't be found at all in any of those places. And if it can't be found at all in any of those places, it can't exist, because we've exhausted the possibilities by setting up the meditational structure in that way. And so it's very, very logical, and each step leads with great force onto the next step. And so I think that's what is meant by easy. This one technique of realizing emptiness will resolve this fundamental problem that's the source of suffering. But when it says easy, I don't think it means that one's going to realize emptiness quickly, but one can gain a very strong intellectual understanding of what emptiness must be and what it must not be. And I think, again, Tsongkhapa's presentation of the meaning of emptiness is dependent arising, and the meaning of dependent arising is emptiness, is incredibly profound and worthy of investigation. The logic is that if things existed inherently in and of themselves, they could not be influenced by other factors. So they couldn't be dependent arisings. Because things are dependent arisings, they must be empty. There's no alternative. They're dichotomies, mutually exclusive, mutually contradictory, exclusive dichotomies, if you like. I'm not laying on the terms there, but it's to show that they can't exist in the same place. One knocks the other one out necessarily. And so through investigative meditation, one can come to a convincing account of this, sort of within that one's own understanding. And that feeling will deepen over time. One's meditation will become richer and able to probe more deeply. So does that answer the question?
It definitely does. It's just a question that my level of progress is such that I'm so far away from there.
I don't think that's, I mean, I'm being a bit naughty here. I'd say I don't think that's true. I would suggest that you think that your level of progress is so far away from that you can't. I'm not saying that to just personally dismiss you or anything dreadful like that. I think that doubt is actually not very realistic, because just having an active, open curiosity into the topic is already powerfully effective in overcoming innate self-grasping. Arya Davis says in his 400 to even doubt that things don't exist inherently shatters the foundations of samsara. Even the inkling of a doubt that things don't exist in the way that I'm presuming them to exist is already shaking the foundations of samsara. We haven't realized emptiness, but we're beginning to prise apart the edifice that enables our innate self-grasping to remain intact and unshaken. So curiosity is another word for doubt, I think, here. If we have a doubt for curiosity that will say, well, just because that vase or that cup appears to be the most beautiful cup I've ever seen, I collect, I'm a cup collector. And for whatever reasons, I've determined that this is the most beautiful cup I've ever seen. That mind that's grasping that most beautiful cup I've ever seen is seeing the most beautiful cup I've ever seen-ness coming from the side of the cup, and as an inhering quality of the cup. But in fact, it's simply a projection. There is a cup here, we're not arguing that, but I'm adding on all these extra layers of qualities that are, I mentioned once before, sticking to it, because we're believing that the object at its fundamental base is innately existent. So it's really there already in and of itself. This is the basis for the afflictions to start building themselves up and to get up and away. So even doubting that our perception of reality of the cup as a real cup from its own side, independently of my labeling cup, as Joseph Rinpoche would say, is leading us a long way close towards realizing its emptiness of inherent existence. So once walking once in an airport with Lambas of Rinpoche, and it was Melbourne Airport, he'd been visiting Australia, and we're walking on the aisle of a airport. They're uniquely odd places, aren't they? Corridors in airports. And Rinpoche said, every step empty, wall empty, foot empty, walking empty, suitcase empty. This process of just labeling empty to everything that we see is a powerful, powerful practice. And we can do that right now. So there are many ways of working with these meditations in our current circumstance.
One of my
I'll just mention before we go on, I mentioned last week this baby example. If the baby Chosang was inherently existent, there couldn't be an adult Chosang sitting here asking me questions, because you'd be immune to change. So you can't be inherently existent. So that's already a remarkable idea, isn't it? So the very possibility of change is enriched by our understanding of emptiness, if you like. We recognize more deeply why change is possible, particularly in relation to the mind, which is Shantideva's topic. If the mind was inherently afflicted, then there'll be no path, no scope to become enlightened.
And Dr. Ross, does anybody, can you hear me? All right.
Is it Jay talking?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, try something again.
All right.
Yeah. No.
Look. Okay. One of the blocks that I have to this, and I haven't heard it addressed anywhere, is at length, is that when I start to, in a sense, it feels like disassemble my universe is what we're talking about. All of my bases on which I have previously lived, assuming that materialism was where it was at, right? When I start to dissemble that, I have an actual fear reaction, like that response of like, things are not as I have always thought they are. And yeah, I just have an emotional reaction. I don't know how to handle that. Is there any advice or anything I can read that addresses that?
I think it's important, isn't it, to recognize that things do exist validly
Yeah,
as dependent
that's
arisings. Because if you shake that ground up, you're engendering another problem, which is referred to technically as nihilism, because you don't have anything left to hold on to at all. And so Tsongkhapa's very precise in his presentation of these topics, and he says that a mind realizing emptiness does not in any way injure our awareness of conventionalities. In fact, it enhances them. The problem isn't that things exist. It's the problem is that we're superimposing a mode of existence onto those things that's in excess of what's actually there. That is the portion of the problem. So we don't attempt to dismantle ordinary things as ordinary things. My example of the cup was simply just to express how that cup becomes a compelling object of attachment, so much so that I can get into terrible emotional and other kinds of trouble by attempting to not let it go or not letting it break, for example. That is the issue. The portion that enables the afflictions to flourish there is the problem, not the cup itself. So I'm not the problem. Stephen's not the problem. It's the way in which Stephen or me or whoever is misapprehending the reality of the self that is the problem. And so this is the dismantling that we need to do. We tease those apart, but we don't tease the cup apart so that it doesn't exist. That's not what we call an ultimate analysis in Tsongkhapa's presentation here. Oh, it's not just Tsongkhapa, but it's referred to as an ultimate analysis because it's looking for a final mode of existence of things. It's not actually interrogating the conventional existence of things. So these points are made very clearly in the Lam Rim presentations. And particularly Tsongkhapa's middle-length Lam Rim has a very famously concise presentation of the four essential points as a mode of analysis that I mentioned to Cha-Sang. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't, I certainly can't. Unfortunately,
again,
yeah. Okay, let me try again. That's all right?
Yeah, I can't see you. I think it's why I'm having trouble finding out who's talking. Yeah.
Okay, it's Jay. Look,
Yeah.
I understand the concept of conventional reality versus ultimate reality,
Yeah.
but it gives me very little solace for some reason. So again, I just think it's one of those projects I get to work on really, really hard.
Yeah.
God. Thank you.
I think, grab it on the run, I say. This famous analogy Tsongkhapa gives of the snake in the grass. He says this is the measure of our mental capacity to impute something there. That in reality, in this example, there's a piece of rope, as we know. It's a very famous analogy. There's a piece of rope lying in the grass, and it's maybe striped or configured in such a way decoratively that it resembles the pattern of a snake. It might be coiled, it might be partly obscured, it might be dusk, and so forth. We don't see any of that. We are looking at the grass and we see a snake there appearing towards us. That snake is purely a product of our conceptual mind. There is not one atom of a snake there. Not one atom. And so anyway, my example is to relate that to everyday experiences. So someone's walking towards me and I go, oh, here's my enemy coming at me. That enemy is a conceptual projection there. It's not saying that there isn't someone who's wishing to harm me, not there. But by enemy, I mean it's that sort of totalized, self-accomplished enemy that is there always already as my threat. That is a production of my mind. If I realize the emptiness of that situation, and there was someone out there who was intent on harming me, for example, I'll be able to deal with that situation in completely different ways that wouldn't involve afflicted minds potentially, such as if one was if one was a Bodhisattva, there'd be the capacity to deal with that situation in an incredibly skillful way, because there'd be no fear of the self being harmed.
Many thanks.
Stephen? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ross. I just say, so I found this in Pabanka's Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about once, well, Jay Rinpoche, so Tsongkhapa was giving a discourse on the view in Sarah Choding Hermitage. Sherab Sengye realized the view and became afraid, grabbing the collar of his monk's shirt. Jay Rinpoche understood what had happened, and this made him happy.
Mm.
So
yes, that's another aspect to the answer, isn't it? Do you want to continue, Stephen? Sorry.
Yeah. So Jay just made Jay Rinpoche happy if they were together. And then after that, there's another paragraph that talks again about Golchu Togme Zangpo. When he gave a discourse on the view, some of his disciples became terrified as well. So this is not uncommon. It's I guess an indicator of progress. And then he talks a little bit about some of the errors that might cause fear in the next couple of paragraphs. So that's Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand on page 637 and 638, which might be helpful to you, Jay.
Thank you. I know Lama Zopa Rinpoche often discusses fear in relation to meditation and emptiness as well. And he says, proceed through the fear.
Yeah.
Right through it. Because it's that fear that could act as an obstructive force preventing you from realizing emptiness in that very meditation session. So getting back to Stephen's helpful contribution there via Babonka, the fear in this circumstance can be a manifestation that one's so doubtful that the I to which I was clinging as the real one doesn't exist, in fact, at all. That is on the verge of realizing the selflessness of oneself as an inherent existent person. And so to continue without fear. You're fearful, but continue to cut through that fear without fear in order to have the realization dangling on the other side, if you like. But I still think there's ordinary fears that we must consider might be in play as well if one isn't, is one analysing emptiness in such a way that one's injuring things as conventional appearances, if you like. So we need to decide which of the two kinds of fears we're working with there. We might conclude there because we're running a little over time, and I'll ask Lou to very kindly lead our dedication prayers. Thank you, everyone, for contributing.
Dedication prayers from Shantideva. For as long as space endures and for as long as living beings remain, till then may I too abide, dispel the misery of the world. May all the pains of living creatures ripen solely upon myself, and through the might of the Bodhisattva Sangha, may all beings experience happiness. May the teachings which are the sole medicine for suffering and the origin of every joy be materially supported and honored and abide for a very long time. I prostrate to Manjughosha, through whose kindness wholesome minds ensue, and I prostrate to my spiritual masters, through whose kindness I develop. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha, and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that's not arisen arise and grow. May that which has arisen never diminish, but increase more and more. May my venerable Lama's life be firm, his white divine action spread in the 10 directions, dispelling the darkness of all beings in the 3 realms. Long life prayers, Holiness Dalai Lama. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, the incomparable, the kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech. May all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. In a land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All-powerful Chen Rezuk Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until psychic existence is ended. I pray for the swift return of Lama Zopa Rinpoche. Peerless teacher and assembly of children, victorious ones, Shravakas, Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losang Father and Sons, together with your lineage, all the offers of refuge of the infinite lands, please now bestow the virtue and goodness to accomplish this prayer. And holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings to explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience is never discouraged. Incomparable venerable Guru, to you I make request. Sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, while striving exclusively for the welfare of the victorious one's teachings and mother living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. At this I lost hope. Nevertheless, to the undeceiving truth, are the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels, and the great waves of the mind generation of the children of the victorious ones. May the smile of a new reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples.
Thank you very much, everyone. And I look forward to meeting you again next week. And have a good study time in the meantime, maybe dipping a little bit into the Lam Rim presentation of the Six Perfections that provides a really fantastic background for the verses that are coming. So thank you. Thank you, Lou, for leading.